I recently watched North by Northwest. This was a member request from Mr. Divine. I think Mr. Divine and Jay are trying to turn me from a filthy casual to a filthy cinephile with all these old classic movies. But it was a really good movie. Definitely one that I wouldn't have watched without someone making me. But I really enjoyed it. And something I think is really lost today when you watch these old movies is just how much they fit in. This movie is 2 hours and 15 minutes, and it fits a ton in compared to 2 hour and 15 minute movies now, like Furiosa, for example. They just feel bloated. It feels like they have a certain amount of money and they feel obligated to spend it instead of just telling the story that you need to tell, trying to be concise, trying to be efficient with your scenes. Every scene in this movie accomplishes multiple things, by which I mean progressing the plot, you get character insight, maybe a little bit of humor. There's not really any wasted time in these older movies, which is just really nice to see, because it's super frustrating that like every movie now is 2.5 hours and it has 2/3 acts, and you're sitting in the theater kind of fidgeting and like, oh my God, why is everyone talking so slowly? Why are we wasting so much time? Everything just feels gratuitous. I feel like movies, particularly in this era, but really all the way through like the 2000s, were just much more efficient with their screen time. I think the main takeaway that I'm getting from these old movies is that movies were just better when it was all white men, the women were either secretaries or whores, and the coloreds were all servant roles.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Obviously, I'm just kidding. But it really just is crazy how quick everything goes. And the 2 hours and 15 minutes just kind of fly by. And you never feel like, oh, this scene was put in for a bathroom break, which is almost how movies now feel. And the characters just feel so much more fleshed out. And like the story is just playing itself out based on their actions, not based on the script. And the gist of the plot for this movie is that Roger Thornhill just accidentally gets caught up in this underground world with very sketchy people who want to kill him because of a mix-up in identity. Only a couple minutes into the movie, he gets kidnapped. They force a bottle of liquor down his throat and then put him behind the wheel and try to run him off the road to make it look like a suicide. And they've mistaken him for George Kaplan, who's not even a real person. As the movie goes on, you find out that the person responsible for this, Philip Van Dam, is actually being investigated by the government, and they've created George Kaplan out of nowhere. And Thornhill ends up kind of being their scapegoat. When they've realized that he's been mistaken for Kaplan, they just decide to let it go because they have other agents working for Van Dam, and they don't want to expose them, and he functions as a good distraction. And they're willing to sacrifice him to go after Van Dam. I kind of wonder if this is the first type of movie like this on screen, just because of the era and the age. Obviously, this is right at the beginning of the Cold War. It gets referenced a couple times. But the way that it's done feels very natural. And this is one of the benefits that older movies have had that I've talked about in other videos when I talk about these older movies, is they don't have to explain away cell phones and social profiles and DNA. They can literally just have a mistaken identity, and it's believable enough because information is so slow. You get like a general description of somebody. It's easy to imagine a mix-up. Obviously, there's no cell phones. There's not constant contact. Even things like TV back then were super limited to a couple stations. Newspapers were every day-ish. So you don't have to worry about writing out all of this shit for a mistaken identity. You can just kind of have it and go. And the way that he handles it just feels so real throughout the movie too. Where at first he's like, yeah, this is really amusing. There's a mistake. Essentially fuck off, but in a polite 1950s way. And he gets more and more frustrated as it goes on. And then due to unfortunate circumstances, no one believes him because it sounds crazy. They've removed the evidence by the time he gets back to the house. It makes him seem like a lunatic. And they frame him pretty easily for all these crimes. And then it looks like he murdered somebody. Obviously, you don't have security cameras everywhere or cell phones like you do now. So it's very easy to make sense of all that. And I don't know if this is a Hitchcock thing or a 1950s and 60s thing, or maybe the actors are just charismatic. I mean, I'm not even super into old films, and I've heard of Cary Grant and Martin Landau, but the banter and like the quippiness and the way they talk, it's really entertaining. Even when he's talking to his mom, they're both kind of talking shit to each other. Very sarcastic. Like she's bitching about being late for her card game and he's like, good, then you'll lose less money. It's very quick and back and forth. It just feels very normal. And I don't know if that's just this movie or if that's the era or if it's just a Hitchcock thing or what, but I really enjoyed the style. It's very distinct. He runs into Eve Kendall, played by Eva Marie Saint, who's apparently alive still and 100. Obviously she's a looker in this movie. Even at 100, still would.
Oh, you know what I'm talking about.
But what you end up finding out along the way is that she's the undercover agent, and him being around kind of puts her at risk because of his behavior. And then they get what I would call a kind of condensed love story. It mainly seems, at least to start out, shallow, but they get along pretty well and they do put effort in and they have good chemistry. It's a lot of fun. And it's interesting because this movie does some pretty good things, I think, with the relationship dynamic between the two, where a lot of modern things kind of fuck this up because they don't want to have the classical man chases the woman and is the aggressor initiator type relationship. And this movie actually doesn't do that fully, but she's clearly seducing him to manipulate him to begin with. And then as it goes on and he's being a little bit pushier with her and what he wants, she's slowly being worn down and kind of acknowledging how she feels. The reason I think modern movies fuck this up is because they interpret any kind of pushiness on the man's part as sexual harassment, unethical, that sort of thing. Of course, unless, it's the Acolyte and Manny Jacinto murders all of your friends in front of you, but then bathes naked and you can just fuck him. But in most stuff, they won't have the man be the chaser and the girl do the thing where she resists but gets worn down because they view that as immoral. And I think what sort of gets lost in translation between the generations or the eras is it's not him pummeling her into submission and forcing his feelings on her until she reciprocates. It's a situation where they both are attracted, they both know they're attracted, but there's a sort of decorum and almost theater to go through to maintain reputation and image and that sort of thing, where the woman at least has to seem like she's resisting, even if it's what she actually wants, and the man has to kind of prove that he's serious by continuing to go after her until it's all out in the open. And then the old school thing, I would think, would be an actual relationship, not just a hookup and then be on your way. And even as you go forward, you can see, obviously, he wants to have sex with her, but he's also pursuing a relationship. It's not just a hookup, or at least that's not how it's framed. So it's always interesting to me to see the dynamics of relationships between men and women in these older movies, because obviously they're much more traditional, they're much more clearly defined. But even a movie like this, which is 60 years old at this point, still lets her be kind of the seducer and the manipulator. She's not just some helpless woman. I'm not sure if this was progressive at the time or what, but she doesn't just feel like a prop. She actually feels like a person trying to do a job and kind of fucking up by catching feelings along the way, which I really enjoyed. I like the relationship a lot, even though the initial attraction, I think, feels a little bit rushed and maybe a little bit shallow. But obviously it's complicated to say because she is undercover. She is trying to use him. So it's not quite as simple as love at first sight, but it's definitely not intended on her end, at least. And you could kind of call him an idiot for being a national fugitive and thinking some smoking ass blonde chick is just hitting on him out of coincidence. It also has one of the most famous scenes, I would say, in movie history, where he's running from this crop duster plane. Even Family Guy had an episode called North by North Quahog, where they reenact this scene. Obviously, it's much more humorous with Peter than it is here with Thornhill. Just thought it was worth mentioning because I would imagine most people who enjoy movies have at least seen this scene like I have or had, even if you hadn't seen the movie. But to continue with the relationship thing that I think is interesting, it's also worth pointing out that the people in this movie are conventionally attractive, which is crazy to mention, but we're in an era where people want to insist that Halle Bailey and Anya Taylor-Joy and Zendaya are the epitome of beauty. You can throw Lizzo in there too if you want. And in reality, we can all see what attractive people look like and just understand on an intuitive level who's attractive and who's not. And it's always nice to go back to the old movies where they don't shy away from it because they understand that movies are a form of escapism and that people want to look at attractive people. Fucking crazy that has to be said out loud. But I really enjoy Thornhill throughout the movie. He's pretty quick on his feet for the most part. Obviously, he's a little bit of a sucker for Eve. Most men would be. There's a reason that OnlyFans is so fucking popular. But I love this auction scene in particular where he figures out that Van Damme doesn't want him going to the cops because he might say something that could get Van Damme in trouble. So he makes a big scene at this auction, giving these really bullshit amounts and trying to go lower on the bids. and just causing a scene until he gets arrested. But even then, he kind of gets screwed over by it. And that's where he finds out that the government was using him unknowingly. And then at that point, they actively recruit him And they're like, hey, we need you to help get the target off Eve's back. And even though he thinks it's bullshit, he obviously wants to do it because it's the girl that he wants. Everyone is relatively clever. They're quick on their feet. It's always nice to watch movies with competent characters and not bumbling fucking idiots or massive coincidences. And the movie does a good job setting up throughout the different locations that are going to be traveled to. And it allows the movie to end up with a pretty epic venue for the finale being Mount Rushmore. And this is brought up in the first few minutes of the movie that George Kaplan, who he's been mistaken for, has plans to go to all these places. They do a really fun thing where Eve pretends to have a freak out and shoot him with blanks. And this is to get the attention off her and back onto Thornhill. And this allows her to go back undercover. She's supposed to travel out of the country with Van Damme, and Thornhill gets pissed. And then the government has him knocked out. But I like it because she ends up getting caught because of this gun that fires blanks, because the main bad guy has smart henchmen. And then later on, Thornhill is being held at gunpoint and realizes it's a gun with blanks, and that allows him to escape to go help save Eve on the face of Mount Rushmore and kind of save the day. Something that surprised me a bit was how abrupt the ending was. And on the first watch, I was a little bit annoyed by it, but after sitting and thinking about it for a bit, I actually think I don't mind it as much, because essentially what you have is they're all fighting on Mount Rushmore, the bad guys all get knocked off, and Thornhill is trying to save Eve by grabbing her hand, and she's barely hanging on, and he's doing the, reach for me, grab my hand thing, and then it just cuts, and the way it's edited is he's pulling her up into the bunk bed on a train. Obviously, you know that he's saved her, they're together, and then we get a nice, really subtle innuendo of them getting in the bed and a train going into the tunnel. And that's the end of the movie. And while it does feel abrupt, I don't know if you actually need to show the whole scene of him picking her up on the cliff and just, them being out of breath and the whole dramatics of it. Like, that he's going to save her. He does save her. And they end up together. Presumably his name's been restored. I don't think it's a far-fetched assumption. And it's kind of wrapped up. You don't need to drag it out and show every single thing when it's pretty obviously implied. And that also just sort of speaks again to the efficiency and not a waste of screen time, where you could drag out the ending for 15 minutes and, show the wedding and him going back to his family and getting his job back and all the details. Or you can just kind of understand as the audience, it's a happy ending. No reason to go crazy with showing everything. We all understand. I can see why it's a classic. I think it holds up really well. Just the dialogue and the banter, the acting. Obviously, there's some definitely dated visuals, but not a huge deal when you have good writing. I think Hitchcock's style looks pretty modern. Like some movies, the way that they're shot and the way they feel, just feel like they're from an older, different era. This movie didn't really feel that way to me. It didn't feel dated, at least in that capacity. Obviously, when you're looking at the cars and the clothes and that sort of thing, it's a little bit different. You can't help that kind of stuff. But overall, really good movie. A good recommendation from Mr. Divine. You guys really nailed it this month. 3 for 3 with Hunter x Hunter, Mad Max 2, and North by Northwest. Really enjoying the recommendations. Arigato. I'm on my way to being a filthy critic snob, so I look forward to that day. I'm going to need to break out a thesaurus so I can sound more sophisticated and pompous. But yeah, really good movie. Really enjoyed it. Not too much else to say. I'm sure there's people who are much more autistic and articulate who've given crazy in-depth breakdowns in this movie. I just kind of want to talk about what I liked about it and how well I think it held up over time. So thanks, Mr. Divine. I'll leave it there for this one. If you've seen it, let me know what you think. I try to respond to the comments that aren't just insults. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. And like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.